What is identity? And does it preserve through change? And do we answer these questions differently for objects than we do for people? Also, why do we study Western philosophy? What about Eastern philosophy? Let's talk about it.
Today we'll be studying the Presocratics. We'll talk about why we study Western philosophy and why Western philosophy began with the Greeks. We'll talk about the Presocratic beginnings in critical thinking and their schools of thought, as well as their influence on Socrates and some Presocratic investigations. First, why are we studying Western philosophy, and why did it start with the Greeks? Well, in the broadest sense, everyone does philosophy. Everyone has a worldview. But philosophy as a discipline studies the justification for beliefs based on evidence, and philosophy becomes a sort of science of its own. It applies logic in critical thinking. Many philosophers from many different times and places, these are non-Western philosophers, might include Zoroaster from Persia, or Solomon from Israel, Confucius from China. Notice the dates, these are ancient philosophers, Sun Tzu from China as well, Paul of Tarsus, the first one we have listed here in AD, Avicenna in the Middle Ages, Muslim from Uzbekistan, Maimonides, who is Jewish from Israel. Now, why don't we study non-Western philosophers? There's several answers to this. The easy answer is that we actually do. Some of those philosophers that I just mentioned become incorporated into Western philosophy. For example, Solomon or Paul of Tarsus, Avicenna, and Maimonides. They have huge influences on Western philosophy, so they get incorporated in, and we do study them, even if technically they're not Western, whatever Western really means. Another one is tradition. The Presocratics began a method of investigating justification that caught on and continues today. Non-Western philosophies have often developed into religions rather than philosophy. So there have been philosophers all over the world, even before the Presocratics, just randomly popping up here and there. But the traditions that formed after them usually became religions and did not continue to progress, treating philosophy as a science. So there was a distinct, unique kind of tradition that formed after the Presocratics. Style or method. Non-Western philosophy tends to be more proverbial and mystic, whereas Western philosophy is more analytic. So we will see a little bit more of the differences here in a moment as we compare Eastern and Western philosophy. Now, just to sort of bookmark an idea, we need to define what philosophy is. So philosophy is an inquiry and critical thought that investigates reasons for beliefs about the world and our place in it. This is one of many possible definitions of philosophy, to narrowly define it as a science. So just to give some generalities, comparing Eastern and Western philosophy, again, there's going to be easy counterexamples to these all over the place, but these are just broad sweeping patterns that have been observed. In terms of method, Eastern philosophy is often proverbial, meaning it's a lot of lists of sayings, like Confucius is a good example of that, or even Solomon writing Proverbs. It's often poetic and mystic and narrative. In the West, there have also been proverbial collections of sayings, but that tends to be a lot less and a lot earlier on. Very quickly it becomes analytic and discourse-oriented rather than narrative in its genre. In terms of content, the East focuses on moral philosophy, community life, sometimes even paradoxes and mysticism, whereas the West, it also focuses on moral philosophy, but it tends to become more analytic and technical with its own distinctive vocabulary and an emphasis on logic. It also sweeps over every area of philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology, and axiology, rather than just focusing primarily on ethics. Some misconceptions are that the East is anti-logical. You see 2 + 2 = 4 whether you're in the East or the West. And to appeal to one of Aristotle's 3 laws of logic, 3 principles of logic, one of them says that something cannot be both true and not true at the same time in the same way. Now that principle is going to be true whether you're in the East or in the West. In fact, even to try to claim to deny it, that claim, that proposition, is going to have to assume that there is such a thing as truth before it can even state the truth claim that there is no truth, or that there is that contradiction is possible. So these most fundamental laws of logic are applied to all thought, no matter when you exist, no matter where you live, no matter what ethnicity you are, no matter what language you speak. That's always going to be the same. Even if your philosophy is expressed through cultural means, it is a misconception to say that the East is anti-logical. In fact, it is very logical and emphasizes logic a lot, even if not always in all of the same ways. All right, and then a misconception about the West is that it's racist, elitist, or ethnocentric. Now, in modern day Europe and Australia and America, we do tend to have a higher economic status than some of the developing nations of the world. However, that's changing, thankfully, and that's not always been the case. Of course, how wealthy a country is makes no difference as to whether or not their ideas are correct or incorrect. If essentially we are pursuing truth and we love truth, it doesn't matter what race someone is, it does not matter what their socioeconomic status is, it does not matter where they are on the planet. And so, because philosophy developed as a distinct science and tradition in Europe, in and around Europe, we study people from those areas because that's where it was booming. It is not for any racial reasons or anything like that. And then let's compare resulting traditions. So in the East, if there's a philosopher, the tradition that forms after them tends to continue to be proverbial, mystic, and often religious. Confucius is a good example of that. Confucius in China. In the West, philosophy develops as a science, and people continue to agree or disagree, develop new ideas based on predecessors, and develops all of the other branches of the sciences. Now, why did it start with the Greeks? Why did Western philosophy start with the Greeks? Well, nobody knows, but here's an educated guess. There's an easy alphabet. The Greek alphabet is even easier than the English alphabet. The English alphabet is based upon the Greek alphabet. It is easy to learn. So a lot of people learn how to read. More people than, say, compare how complicated the Chinese alphabet appears. Right? It's more difficult to learn, so it's more difficult to get a large number of people to learn it. Another one is Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great conquers much of the known world. Actually, he is after the Presocratics, but because of the expansion of the Greek Empire, language also expanded, which means that communication expanded. So more people can read, and more people know the same language, so there can be a larger exchange of ideas. And then, of course, after Greece, the Roman Empire continues to expand, which expands the number of people who are exchanging ideas, right? And civilization is expanding, so that means that roadways become paved and straight, and goods and ideas can travel around Europe more quickly. Common language in Europe and the Near East, that makes it easy to communicate ideas. The results are going to be a higher literacy rate and a wide exchange of ideas. Technology and civilization thus boom. We'll look at a map here in a moment to kind of illustrate this. Some reminders for going forward. Philosophy is the love of wisdom. First and foremost, we're seeking the truth. And we want to know what the truth is, no matter who said it, no matter where it was found, no matter when it was said. And we judge whether or not a proposition or an idea is true based on how reasonable it is. That's the critical thinking that we've learned in other videos. A philosophy is not of a particular tradition, it is of reality, even if it was first discovered and expressed by a certain society. For example, philosophy is right no matter who said it or when it was said, because it rightly describes reality. That's what qualifies as truth. So for example, the Pythagorean theorem is of reality. This is a mathematical formula about triangles. It is not a Greek mathematical formula. It is a formula that describes reality, even though the Presocratic Pythagoras and his followers discovered and advocated it. That does not mean that math is a Greek concept. It does not mean that geometry is a Greek concept. It's a concept about reality. Though we sometimes talk of Greek philosophy as the ideas of people who were Greek that influenced Greek culture. So we might talk about Greek philosophy in a broad, sweeping way to kind of talk about the philosophies of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, or those who came before them or soon after. But really, we're just using that as a convenient way to group these philosophies together, even if there's no particular reason to group them together other than geographical. Now let's talk about the Presocratic beginnings in critical thinking. What's their contribution? Let's look at a map. This is Europe without borders. We have ancient Greece, which is roughly 800 to 330 BC. This is the time of the Presocratics, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Okay, but at the same time, there were colonies all over the place, all over Europe and around the Mediterranean. And then Alexander the Great conquered much of the known world at the time, extending Greece into Asia. And then the Greek Empire fell to the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire largely expanded throughout Europe. So this is kind of Western philosophy at the time. And you can tell through Alexander the Great and through the Roman Empire that this includes some of the Middle East. So that's some explanation as to how some Muslim philosophers and Jewish philosophers get incorporated into Western philosophy. All right, so the Presocratics. Let's look at an example from the poet Hesiod. This is an example of Hesiod from Presocratic explanations of natural phenomena. So before the Presocratics, this is how we would explain things that happen in nature. From Hesiod, he says, "Tell me these things, Muses, who dwell on Olympus, from the beginning, and tell me which of them was born first. First of all, chaos came into being. Next came broad-breasted Gaia, Earth, the secure dwelling place forever of all the immortals who hold the peak of snowy Olympus, and Mercury Tartarus, underworld, in a recess of the broad-rounded Earth." So here he is discussing the origins of the universe as directly extending from these gods. All right, he appeals to the Muses. But isn't there a way to explain nature through causation? Are these mystical beliefs correct? What's the evidence that these mystical and religious beliefs are actually true? Now, this is not to say that the Presocratics were trying to question their religious beliefs, but they wanted a more detailed understanding of how the world came about, how causation took place. The Presocratics wanted to reject uncritical thinking. There were beliefs that were passed on from generation to generation, but now they not only want beliefs, but they want justification for why these beliefs are true. All right? Thales of Miletus, who's often considered the first philosopher, the first Presocratic, predicted an eclipse using astronomy. That had not been done in Greece before. Of course, that had been done in other places in the world, independently of Greek culture. So the Aztecs, for example, come up with a very good calendar in the Americas. But Thales, starting to predict the eclipse and appeal to natural causes, initiates what become the sciences later on in the Western world. He and others began to investigate the origin and nature of the universe. All right, so let's have a definition of Presocratic. They're just the philosophers before and contemporary with Socrates that were not influenced by him. Okay, they're not actually all before Socrates. Some of them are contemporary with him. But after he comes on the scene, he and his student Plato and his student Aristotle, everyone after them tends to be so highly influenced by Socrates that we put an end to this group of people we call the Presocratics. Thales of Miletus, living around 600 BC, is often known as the first of them, and then you have Socrates for point of reference. So the Presocratics are roughly 600 to 400 BC. The philosophy in general did not start with the Presocratics, and it did not start in Greece, but Western philosophy did. So there are philosophers before the Presocratics and in other areas of the world than Greece. We saw a list of non-Western philosophers earlier on in this same presentation, and many of them came before the Presocratics and were not from Greece. Now here's just a picture, a painting by Raphael that's in the Vatican, painted on the walls, a fresco of the Presocratics, and you can see many of them here. I'm not going to identify any of them at the moment, but there's a lot of them. And in this picture are also Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. We'll point to those later. So why were the Presocratics different from their predecessors? What makes them distinct? What unites them? What contribution did they make to philosophy? Well, there's the same answer for all of these questions. They were rejecting uncritical thinking and replacing it with seeking evidence for beliefs. All right, here's some characteristics. As far as method goes, they were going to appeal to evidence instead of superstition. Right? They wanted beliefs, not necessarily even different beliefs, but they wanted evidence for these beliefs. Greek philosophers were not atheists. Atheism does not become a widespread current until, say, the Enlightenment. They just wanted to explain how the world functions without deus ex machina, without just an immediate appeal to the gods. Perhaps the gods work through causes. What are those causes? Right? There's an assumption that the world can be explained through specific causes. The goal is the justification for beliefs. Okay, these three basic concepts for the method, assumption, and goal of the Presocratics sets them apart from their predecessors. Let's look at some schools of thought among the Presocratics. So we've talked about Thales. All right, he is considered the first philosopher. He predicted an eclipse with astronomy. Again, that's not unique, but it marked the beginning of an appeal to evidence and rejection of uncritical thinking that developed into the field of philosophy. He asked what persists through change. All right, what is common to all things? And he started to conjecture material. Okay, there's a material cause, or often called prime matter, which is water. So he said he saw that things around him, objects in the world, change. You have things that are destroyed, but even though an object may be destroyed, you're left with a pile of rubble. Or something is burned, but you're still left with a pile of ash. And you can take raw materials and make something out of them. You see a seed grow from a seed, plus water, it grows into a plant. So he conjectured that since water is so prevalent in this world, that everything is somehow made of or comes from water. Right? Aristotle said this is reasonable because all things are moist. Even when you think about the opposite of moisture, you think about fire. Fire, for Thales, was something going out of existence. So it was the negation of existence. And so water would be evaporated, would be burned away. All right, so that's Thales. And then we're still, the Presocratics are largely asking what persists through change and what's common to all things. All right, so Thales first starts to say that matter is common and persists through change. Even though something is burned up or grows or turns into something else, that continues. Okay, Thales says that fundamentally the thing that is continuing is water. We see that different objects are made out of some common materials. What is the most common material? He said that it's water. Anaximander said that it was the boundless, which is indefinite being, something more fundamental even than matter. He wasn't clear on what this was, but it was an interesting step towards metaphysics. All right, and the closest to Plato coming yet. And then Anaximenes, who is a student of Anaximander, said that it was air plus condensation. All right, this is interesting because he provides not only a material, but an identification of the process of causation. So just as water seems to appear out of thin air through condensation, perhaps all matter comes through something like condensation of the air, maybe condensation in different ways, right? And then Heraclitus says that it's fire. Again, these different ideas may sound ridiculous to us 2,500 years later, but if you think about fire more abstractly, like Heraclitus does, you might think of it just as energy. And so when Einstein said E equals mc squared, that's energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. This is to say that energy can turn into matter, and matter can turn into energy. That's how we get a nuclear bomb, because matter turns into energy. All right. So perhaps this was not so crazy. 2,500 years ago, 2,600 years ago, somebody is starting to lay the foundations of science and of what becomes Einstein's theories. Okay? Parmenides says, he points to permanence. He sees that there's some sort of conservation of matter and that it never really goes away. And so he says, instead of pointing just to one particular kind of matter, like water or air, he points to permanence itself. Okay? Just for point of reference, the four classical elements were water, air, fire, and earth. Sometimes ether is also included there as a somewhat vague fifth element. All right, Heraclitus said that all is in flux. So contrary to Parmenides, he saw that everything is always changing. However permanent something appears, even a rock, if you observe it long enough, you'll see that it changes. So everything is always changing. So it seems to be something true in each of these philosophers. Even if they don't quite have it completely right, something true seems to be present in each one of these. And so each generation continues to take these ideas and analyze them and build on them and refine them. And gradually we develop more and more into some of the natural sciences that we can easily recognize. All right? Empedocles said that the source of nature can't be a single element. Right? That's interesting because we often talk about the periodic table of elements. Right? These are irreducible molecules, or atoms, sorry. Irreducible atoms, and everything is made of these common atoms, right? Not a single element, but many elements. And Anaxagoras said something like a seed, some sort of seed, not just a plant seed, but some kind of seed that grows and is ordered by intelligence, okay? This intelligence doesn't necessarily have to be some kind of person or people like God or the gods, but it's obvious that in nature, things change according to a pattern, okay? There's some consistency, and so we can develop formulas, we can develop an analysis and expect cause to happen in very similar ways. So some kind of order there. And because things change and grow and develop and progress, they had to have started from something smaller, something like a seed, whether that's an abstract idea or something concrete and similar to a plant seed. So let's talk more specifically about schools of thought. You have the Milesians, who we were just discussing. They were asking, what is prime matter, right? Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes. Okay, you have the Eleatics, which talk about reality as dependent upon something unchanging. There has to be something unchanging that rests under or before this changing matter. Okay, here's some different thinkers in that field: Xenophanes, Parmenides, Zeno of Elea, and Melissus. Parmenides is one of the most important ones. He talked specifically about the path of truth and the path of opinion. We'll see some influence of this on Plato later on. He's one of the earliest in metaphysics, studying being as being and emphasizing epistemology, the difference between truth and opinion. And then you have the pluralists, where the world is made of an irreducible pluralism of unchanging substances. Now, this is very similar to the atomists, who say that there are small primary bodies, infinite in number, indivisible, and imperishable. Now, you thought the atom was a modern concept, but no, the atom as some very small primary body of existence by which all things, or of which all things are made. This is an ancient concept. Okay, even more than 2,500 years ago, they're starting to realize that the world is made of some very small body, some very small ingot that everything is made of. All right. Now, the two most important schools of thought to continue thinking about as we go on later into Plato, first are going to be the Pythagoreans, where reality is best understood through math. Okay, math is sort of the first step into abstract thinking. This influenced Plato significantly, so much so that knowledge of math was a prerequisite for admittance to his school called the Academy. You can ask yourself, can you draw a perfect circle? Well, no, you can't. You observe many imperfect circles, and we use induction to discover the perfect mathematical circle. This method is the first step into higher reasoning and understanding. All right, the next school of thought is the Sophists, where they say all apprehension is subjective, right? They were ancient relativists, so to speak. They were known as being hired orators or rhetoricians. They were public speakers that people would hire for advertising or in the court of law. You could think of them kind of as lawyers, and they would defend any proposition, any idea, any claim, depending on who was paying them the most. All right, so here are some of the Sophists. Some of the important ones that Socrates responds to are Gorgias and Thrasymachus. Socrates argues against them to defend objectivism, ultimately to defend the existence of truth and that the field of philosophy is possible. And then, of course, lastly, there's just different independent Presocratics. Heraclitus, talking about fire. He investigated logic and the nature of change. It's just one example we've already mentioned. So the legacy that comes from the Presocratics are being unsatisfied with uncritical thinking. Okay, they introduce some significant changes that develop into critical thinking. We want justification for our beliefs. We want to know if they're true or not and why. What is reason? Of course, the field of metaphysics, asking what is real and what is change. The natural sciences, physics and chemistry, biology, stem from metaphysics. Epistemology, asking how we rationally justify belief. How do we know what's real? And we discover logic. Logic sort of undergirds all of philosophy. And then ethics. Axiology is the third branch of philosophy. And the axiology is divided into aesthetics, which is the study of beauty, and ethics, which is the study of norms in society that prescribe action. All right, we ask how should we react reasonably to situations, and what leads to happiness. Plato and Aristotle build upon the work of the Presocratics. And Plato and Aristotle represent the first, actually Socrates as well, but especially Plato and Aristotle represent the first philosophers who tried to propose a comprehensive system that explains every aspect of reality. And so these two philosophers investigate propositions in every branch of philosophy. Just within their work is sort of an encyclopedia about everything. Let's talk about the Presocratic influence on Socrates. Okay, this is the School of Athens by Raphael again. And here we have Socrates highlighted, and we have Plato. He's pointing up to say that the forms are transcendent in some sense, and Aristotle with his hand pointed down because he developed Plato's ideas and said that the forms were actually in matter. We'll discuss that later as we get to Plato and Aristotle. Now, this is a common chart just showing the flow of Presocratic influences. You can find this online easily. It has different colors for different schools of thought, and the main reason I want to point it out now is to show how they influence Socrates. We have Socrates pop up here. Some Presocratics still pop up after him. To the right of Socrates are some of the Sophists. And Socrates, in turn, influences some three main schools of thought that come after him. Of course, on the left, we have Plato founding his academy. We have Aristippe founding the Cyrenaics, and we have Antisthenes, who founds the Cynics. Okay, and then from each of these continue to develop, but some of the students of these schools interpret these teachers in different ways, and so we have below them branching off. Okay, Stoicism branches off from Cynicism, Epicureanism branches off from the Cyrenaics, and Aristotle branches off from
Plato. Aristotle founds the school of the Lyceum. That's the most important branch we're going to talk about through this course, but we may also talk about the Epicureans and the Stoics as well. And this is just to show how Socrates was also influenced by other how Plato was also influenced by other Presocratics. Now let's jump into some of the actual investigations of the Presocratics. First, we'll look at an example that is similar to the kinds of things the Presocratics did. All right, what is similar about these objects? Obviously, triangle, the concept of triangle, which is not any equivalent to any of these, but it seems to be something in common and present in each of them. Okay, where does triangle actually exist? Just the abstract concept of triangle. How do we know triangle if we've never seen a perfect one before? Okay, that's an epistemological question. The second one is, and the first one might be a metaphysical one. This similarity called triangle is a form, which is a universal. Okay, it is something abstract and common to those different objects. As the Presocratics tried to explain the nature of reality and change, they investigated what causes change and what persists through change. Pythagoreans used math as a first step into higher rationality and understanding of universal concepts. Okay, we can say that triangle helps us describe reality. Socrates and Plato adopted this idea, and Plato required knowledge in math as a prerequisite for entering his school in the academy. We mentioned this already. Here's another good one. What persists through change? You have a person who steps into this river. You have Heraclitus famously saying, "You can't step in the same river twice." This is to say that change destroys identity. Okay, something at first seems correct about this, right? The water is moving on. So when you stick your first foot in the water, your second foot touches different water. And moment by moment, the river is changing. It's continually changing because different material makes up the river at each moment. However, something seems wrong about this too, because we name this river. This river has the same general shape, it's the same location. There's something that stays the same. We continue to call this river, let's say the Mississippi River. We continue to call it by the same name. So something seems to persist through change. Something may be in its identity. But what is identity? Heraclitus would say that there is no identity beyond the material that something is composed of. All right, but is he right? It's a denial of form. The river is the form, a thing that's shaped, that persists through some kind of change, okay? So how can we relate? The big question here is, how can we relate identity to change? Okay, something seems to change and something seems to stay the same. What are those things and how do they relate to each other? But this is early on. Maybe we'll find some answers later. What about a ship? This is a famous example called the Ship of Theseus. Actually, this is not from one of the Presocratics, but it is in the same spirit of the Presocratics by Plutarch at 46 through 120 AD. So you have a ship, and let's say this ship is being used for a certain trade route for 100 years. And let's say it has all the same crew. Let's say they live a long time. It has all the same crew. This is the Ship of Theseus. Now along the way, of course, in order to maintain the ship, sometimes they'll have to repair the sails and replace the sails, but someone collects the old sails and puts them in a pile. Sometimes a plank of wood may need to be replaced here or there, or a piece of metal. And so gradually over the course of 100 years, every single possible piece of this ship has been replaced. It's as good as new, but someone has collected all of the old pieces.
And eventually they have enough of those old pieces to reconstruct the ship. And so now we have two ships. The first ship on the left is the one that has continued the same trade route, has been continually called by the same name, Ship of Theseus, and has had the same crew. But the second ship is made of all of the original materials. So which one is the Ship of Theseus? Some people might say the first one, because its function has always remained the same, and people have continually called that one by the same name. Some people may say the second one is the real Ship of Theseus because it has all of the original pieces. So the question here is, what is more important for naming the identity of an object? Is the material more important, or is the form, the function, the shape, the use of the thing more important? All right? Perhaps this is a false dichotomy. Again, we will continue to see how these two aspects of an object relate to each other. Now, what about change? Change occurred with the ship. What is change? Right? Change and motion are one kind of similar idea. If change is motion, what is motion and what causes it? Okay, so let's say, for example, we have this runner who is trying to get to the finish line. Now, let's say this is a 1 mile race. Now, in order to get 1 mile, let's say he does 1 mile in 6 minutes. Well, in order to go half a mile, that will take him 3 minutes. And a quarter of a mile is going to take him 1.5 minutes. Now, however small you divide up the distance, you will also have to divide up the time. And you can never get to the smallest measurement of distance without it also including some measure of time. And since you can divide up this distance an infinite number of times, that means that no matter how small of a measurement of distance you use, it will always take a certain amount of time to travel that distance. So this means Zeno of Elea concludes that since you can divide it up in an infinite number of times, and each one of those pieces is going to take some amount of time, that means an infinite amount of time elapses between point A and point B, between the beginning and the end of the race. Now, this is just to say that motion for Zeno is an illusion. We see something that appears to be motion, but really nothing is actually changing. Now, this sounds crazy in some sense, but if you think about this, if you have a microscope and you zoom in small enough down to the atomic level or the subatomic level, it seems to be you can get to a point where you can no longer perceive motion and change. All right? So that means that an atom or a proton itself may never change. It's always the same. And you might say, well, it moves, but it only moves in relation to other things. And different things move in relation to different things. But perhaps motion is really just an illusion, because within the smallest possible unit of matter, no motion exists. Perhaps that's the case. Or perhaps it's the other way around. Maybe everything is always in motion. Why are these things even important? Here's an illustration. We have a person. This person loses an arm. Who would say it's the same person? Their identity persists, but something changes, right? They lost an arm, but it's still Joe or Susan, whatever. She lost an arm, but she's still the same person. What about a child? A child grows into an adult, and we still call them the same name. We still say that something persists through change, right? They have an identity that continues. In what sense does this identity persist, and in what sense does it change? Let's have a flower, okay? This is a flower. Let's say I got a flower for my wife
rose or something like that, and eventually the flower actually falls off. I'm left with a stem. All right, so something persists, though. It's the same plant, but something changes too. The rose flower is gone. Something is destroyed. So if my object of investigation is the flower, then it went from existing to not existing. But if my object of investigation is the plant which has the flower, maybe an apple tree, right? The tree is still there even if the flowers have gone, right? It's winter or summer and the flowers have gone away, but the tree is still there. So how does the tree relate to the rose? How does the identity of different aspects of a thing relate to the whole? Let's talk about bread, or rather any ingredient, any collection of ingredients before we cook something, okay? The material obviously persists because, let's say, a cake, it's made of eggs and milk and flour and things like these. But once we have the cake, we no longer have eggs, we no longer have flour, we have a cake. All right, something persists, of course. That's why we still have an object, but at the same time, we have an object now that we did not have before. We have a cake. Before, we just had ingredients. So the material persists, but the identity does not. We now have something we did not have before. But in another sense, we have nothing more now than we had before. So what are we talking about? How do we relate those two ideas to each other? What is it? The answer changes if you're asking about identity, but not if you're asking about material. Okay, so here's a piece of paper, and then you fold it into a paper airplane. Okay, so we still have paper, but now we have something we did not have before. We have a paper airplane, and we no longer have a sheet of paper. We have a paper airplane. Material persists, but identity does not. What is this object? Well, if we're asking about the material, it's paper, and that persists. But if we're talking about the identity or the form, it goes from being a sheet of paper to being a paper airplane. If you have a paper airplane, then tear it up or crumple it up, you still have paper, but not an airplane. Of course, if you burn it, you no longer have paper. You have something else, but the material persists at some level. The form does not persist. Here's a very important example for ethics. When does person persist or not persist? Okay? We have the lifespan of a person. Okay? They transition from conception to being a fetus, to being born, to being a child, to being an adult, to being elderly. Maybe something medical happens, they turn into a vegetative state, it's possible, and then eventually death comes. Okay, what is personhood? Where does it begin, and where does it end? What is life, or a valuable life? Is all human life valuable? What makes human life valuable? Is person, or is valuable life, are those concepts attached to human, or conferred by society, or dependent upon the quality of life? All right, some issues to think about are abortion, euthanasia, and doctor-assisted suicide, and other medical bioethics considerations. If, for example, if personhood depends on a valuable life or quality of life, then we might say that the center three images here are person, okay, a child, an adult, and an elderly person. Or perhaps if personhood is something that is socially conferred, is something that depends on experience and a recognition by the community that you have a role in society, then perhaps personhood starts after birth and grows as the person grows. Or perhaps person is attached to human, and so that all humans are persons. An important aspect of that is that would validate the personhood of mentally handicapped as well as those in a vegetative state. And this is, of course, this is going to relate to doctor-assisted suicide, euthanasia, and abortion. Of course, everybody is going to agree, well, most people are going to agree, that when a person dies, personhood is lost. In fact, human is lost because by definition, human is going to be alive. This is material that was once human. Okay, but when does that exactly happen? Now, these different kinds of pre-Socratic puzzles will challenge common experience to investigate nature. How do we explain reality in a way that makes sense of change, identity, and common observation? Okay, you have a Heraclitus saying that you cannot step in the same river twice. Something seems right about that, but then again, something seems wrong about that too. It seems to try to prove something too specific that does not make sense of common experience. Just to glance ahead, the Presocratics gradually in different ways, in vague ways, start to investigate the four causes that lay the foundation of metaphysics and natural science. We have the material cause. I'm going to go over these quick because we'll investigate these more with Aristotle. They're more importantly investigated in Aristotle. So just to bookmark this idea, we have a material cause. What material is this object made of? The formal cause. What identity persists through change? What are the essential attributes and the accidental or non-essential attributes of this object and its identity? The efficient cause. What is the agent of change? And the final cause. What is the purpose or order that organizes change? What are the consistent laws of nature that order the physical world? Presocratics begin to discover these. Plato reduced these to just form and matter. We'll talk about these in other videos. And Aristotle saw all four as necessary. Again, see my other videos on Plato and Aristotle. Now for the write-up related to the Presocratics. The first question is, if all the molecules in your body are replaced every 7 years or so, and even your personality develops and changes, then what persists through change? All right, what is person, and how is it related to human? Write these questions down, jot down your answers, go online and submit these answers through the online web portal.